Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Welcome back to Spanish Lessons with Professor Jason. In today's lesson, I'm going to talk about relative pronouns. These are the little words or phrases like que, quien, el or la que, or el, la, los, or las cuales, which function as equivalents for words like that, which, who, and whom in English. Now we've got a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the question, what are relative clauses? Relative clauses are subordinate clauses. That means they're attached to or they depend upon main clauses about which they're going to provide additional information. They don't constitute in and of themselves complete sentences. In these examples on the slide, the relative clauses are bolded. So we have things like, I read the book that you recommended. So the that you recommended part is the relative clause, and that is the relative pronoun. He kept the wallet which he found on the subway. Notice I could have said that he found on the subway. He's the student that failed the class, or I could have said the student who failed the class. She wants to marry the guy who she met on the subway, or the guy that she met on the subway. That history professor, whom I really admire, is speaking tonight. That's a clause set off by commas. The artist from Venice, whose work we saw, is moving to Rome. So whose is another relative pronoun that we're not going to talk about in this video, though. Finally, we drove to the beach, which was deserted. Okay, so using the same set of examples, let's focus on the question, what are relative pronouns? The first word of each of these relative clauses is what we refer to as the relative pronoun. So they're words like that, which, who, whom, and whose. The relative pronoun refers to the noun or nouns mentioned in the main clause about which they provide additional details. Now, these nouns are referred to as antecedents since they come before the pronouns in the sentence. It's important to note that relative clauses like these can be classified as either restrictive or non-restrictive. A restrictive clause is one that adds information necessary to fully complete the sentence in terms of its meaning. So of these examples, the first four contain restrictive relative clauses. For example, look at number 3. It doesn't make too much sense to just say, he's the student, period. The last 3 of these examples use non-restrictive clauses. A non-restrictive clause adds information that's complementary or supplementary, but not strictly necessary for full comprehension. So if we look at, for example, number 5, that history professor, whom I really admire, is speaking tonight. I could remove the entire relative clause, whom I really admire, and still have a fully grammatical sentence. That history professor is speaking tonight. Now here are a few more examples that illustrate the differences between restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. Look at number 1. I don't like people who use their cell phones at the movies. Again, it sounds kind of strange without the relative clause, without the restrictive relative clause that restricts the meaning of the noun, the antecedent people. I don't like people. Well, what kind of people? Who use their cell phones at the movies. Number 2, Juan ate the cake that we bought for the party. Those kids who probably already saw the movie were texting the whole time. Number 3, we have a non-restrictive clause. The information between the commas, that relative clause, isn't completely necessary to get across the meaning of the sentence. Those kids were texting the whole time. It's just supplemental information. As with number 4, the cake, comma, which had red frosting and blue sprinkles, comma, was perfect for the occasion. Should have a period. So again, another non-restrictive clauses. I'm trying to point out the use of commas to set off non-restrictive relative clauses because the distinction between restrictive and non-restrictive clauses and the absence or presence of commas are very helpful clues to consider when it comes to picking the right relative pronouns in Spanish. But we'll come back to that idea in just a minute. Another important thing to point out about relative clauses in English is that you can sometimes, but not always, get away with omitting the relative pronouns that or who in restrictive clauses. Take a look. I read the book that you recommended. I can say it without that. I read the book you recommended. She wants to marry the guy who she met on the subway, that she met on the subway, or just simply marry the guy she met on the subway without the relative pronoun. Juan ate the cake we bought for the party. Don't need to say that. However, look at number 4. I don't like people that or who use their cell phones at the movies. I don't like people who use their cell phones at the movies. I can't leave out the relative pronoun. In this case, the sentence wouldn't make sense. So, sometimes they're required in English, sometimes they're optional. Whether a relative pronoun can be omitted in English depends on its grammatical function and the logic of the relative clause. Fortunately for us, I'm not going to delve into that aspect too deeply in this video. All I'll say is that the noun people in the last example would have a different grammatical function in its relative clause than with the nouns book, guy, or cake in the first 3 examples. The important thing to remember is that in Spanish, relative pronouns may never be omitted. This is actually a hugely important point to emphasize because I often hear learners leave the relative pronoun que out in Spanish, presumably because they're thinking through the sentence in English, which is normal and unavoidable. But remember that you have to use the relative pronoun que in these kinds of constructions in Spanish. The rule of thumb would be if it's possible to insert that pronoun or the pronoun that in the English version, you must use it in Spanish, as these examples illustrate. Take a look. I read the book you recommended, left it out in English, but in Spanish I have to include the que. Leí el libro que me recomendaste. She wants to marry the guy she met on the subway. Left out that or who. In Spanish I have to use que. Ella quiere casarse con el tipo que conoció en el metro. Juan ate the cake we bought for the party. No relative pronouns, completely optional. Juan comió la torta que compramos para la fiesta. Again, bottom line, if you can insert the word that in your English sentence, you have to have the relative pronoun in the Spanish version. Okay, let's go ahead and begin our discussion of relative pronouns in Spanish. Let's start off by reviewing the Spanish equivalents for the English relative pronouns that, which, who, and whom. We'll just go through each of them one at a time. Okay, so we can see from this slide, the relative pronoun que in Spanish is extremely versatile, the most versatile and commonly employed relative pronoun in Spanish. It can mean in English that, which, who, or whom, as the examples illustrate, right? Quiero ir a un parque que tenga canchas de tenis. It's that in the English equivalent. Ese mercado que está cerca de la playa no abre hasta las 9. So I could use which in this non-restrictive clause. El hombre que acaba de irse es mi tío. Could be who or that. La secretaria que contratamos es del Perú. In the English equivalent, probably would use whom. So again, que is the most versatile and commonly used relative pronoun in Spanish. I'll come back to this idea. Next up is the relative pronoun quien, or its plural form, quienes, has to agree with the subject. Mi vecino, quien es mecánico, tiene muchos autos. So my neighbor, who is a mechanic, notice we're talking about a non-restrictive relative clause. My neighbor, who is a mechanic, quien es mecánico, has a lot of cars. Or whom, usually after a preposition, the English equivalent is going to be whom. Las personas con quienes nos hospedamos eran muy amables. The people with whom we stayed were very nice. So again, quien or quienes can be who or whom. Now we'll take a look at the first grouping of pronouns that have to agree in number and gender with the thing, the object, or the person or persons that they're referring back to. And I'm going to call this the el que grouping. And understand that that includes la que, los que, or las que. Now these will mean which or whom, and they only follow prepositions. Keep that in mind. La inversión sobre la que hablamos es muy buena. The investment of which we spoke is very good. Or los turistas con los que conversamos eran de México. With whom we spoke. The tourists with whom we spoke. So this family of relative pronouns, the el que grouping, can be either which or whom in English. The second grouping of these longer form or compound relative pronouns in Spanish I would call the el cual grouping or family. El cual, understanding that that encompasses the masculine, feminine, singular, and plural forms. So again, these must agree in number and gender. These are a little bit more versatile. They can stand in for which, who, or whom. Some examples. Esa clase, la cual es muy difícil, comienza a las 10:30. So that class, which is very hard, begins at 10:30. Non-restrictive clause. Encontré esta camisa, por la cual pagué muy poco en el centro comercial, for which I paid very little. Mi gerente, el cual no recuerda mi nombre, siempre me llama Esteban. So my manager, who in this case, who doesn't remember my name, always calls me Esteban. And it can also mean whom, this grouping. No sabía nada de los políticos sobre los cuales estaba leyendo. I didn't know anything about the politicians about whom I was reading. So this is the el cual grouping or family of relative pronouns, standing for which, who, or whom. Okay, one thing all these examples show is the variety of relative pronouns that can be used in Spanish. Obviously, now the tricky thing is to figure out which pronoun or pronouns can and should be used to introduce certain types of relative clauses in Spanish. Unfortunately, this is fairly complicated, which is probably why you're here in the first place, right? Now, I did quite a bit of research on this topic, and in the process, I came across a lot of information, but with a few exceptions, the explanations I found were usually inadequate and sometimes even misleading or wrong. What I've learned is that the choice of the most appropriate sounding or the best or the most grammatical or whatever relative pronoun in Spanish is conditioned by a number of factors, which I've summarized on the next slide. So like I said, the number of factors that influence the choice of which relative pronoun in Spanish is appropriate, sounds the best, is grammatically correct, etc., is fairly long from the research I did. First of all, the function of the pronoun or the function the pronoun would have in the relative clause is key. It could have been a subject, direct object, can refer to the indirect object, the object of a preposition. Or, number two, whether, and this is key, whether the antecedent is a thing or a person. We've already seen lots of examples of both. Three, whether there's a preposition involved. Is there a preposition that precedes or introduces the relative pronoun? Is it de que, de quien, sobre los cuales, etc. Whether the relative clause is a restrictive or a non-restrictive relative clause. And just remember, restrictive relative clauses, you're going to have the relative pronoun, but there won't be any comma. Whereas with non-restrictive clauses, we're talking about those clauses that add supplemental complementary information and are usually set off by commas or a comma. Or the proximity, some people say, the proximity of the relative pronoun to the antecedent. Does it come immediately after? Is there no preposition? Is there a short preposition like de, con, or en? Or does it come after a longer preposition like por los cuales? No, excuse me, something like acerca de, a compound preposition, al lado de, right? Sometimes these will correlate to specific relative pronoun choice. And then finally, and this one is also important to consider, the degree of formality of speech or writing that you want to get across. Obviously, que is probably the most common. Not that it's necessarily informal, but something like the el que or el cual grouping sounds a little bit more formal in speech or writing. Okay, that's maybe too many factors to consider, a lot to keep track of, so my strategy for the rest of the lesson is to condense this formidable topic down into a handful of patterns and guidelines, to illustrate those with lots of examples in the hopes that something's going to make sense and stick in our brains for future reference. And I think I can best do this by focusing on just 3 of the factors we saw on the previous slide. So basically, I think that with a little practice, using these 3 questions to orient us, we can learn to select, with a high degree of accuracy, the most appropriate relative pronouns for various types of configurations that we're going to look at. First question then is the antecedent, the thing we're talking about, does it refer back to a thing or a person? Secondly, do we need a preposition to introduce our relative clause? Remember those prepositions, small words like con, de, en, hacia, por, para, sobre, etc. And then thirdly, and this is also pretty crucial, is the relative clause we're talking about restrictive or non-restrictive? And remember, you can recognize those non-restrictive clauses because they're set off by commas. So let's start by looking at some guidelines that apply to relative pronouns used to refer to things. So guideline for things, the first guideline is, if we're speaking of a thing or things using a restrictive clause whose relative pronoun is not preceded by a preposition, we should simply use que. So we're talking about a thing, there's no preposition, there's no relative clause set off by commas. Just use que. Quiero comprar la camisa que vi en esa tienda. I want to buy the shirt that I saw in that store. Lavé la ropa que llevaba ayer. I washed the clothing that I was wearing yesterday. Vamos a tomar el tren. Vamos a tomar el tren que sale a las 4. We're going to take the train that leaves at 4. If we're speaking of a thing or things using a restrictive clause, again, not set off by comma, whose relative clause is preceded by the preposition con, de, or en, those three specifically, con, de, or en, we can simply use que. Or in the case of more formal speech or writing, or after other prepositions, we can substitute a form from the el que or el cual groupings. Let's look at the examples. Number 1, vamos a leer la novela de que te hablé ayer. So because the prepositions de, con, or en, I can just use que. Number 2, vamos a leer la novela de la que te hablé ayer. Just maybe a smidge more formal. Instead of de que, de la que te hablé ayer. Vamos a leer la novela de la cual te hablé ayer. Maybe a tiny bit more formal. Vamos a leer la novela sobre la que te hablé ayer. Vamos a leer la novela acerca de la cual te hablé ayer. So again, in this configuration, we're talking about a thing. Relative clause is introduced by a preposition. We can use que with the preposition con, de, or en, or we can use el cual or el que, or their variations for singular, plural, masculine, feminine. So again, notice that in these cases, we do have prepositions, but no commas. Another thing you might notice is that the el cual forms sound best after longer or compound prepositions, as we see in number 5. And then finally, if we're speaking of a thing or things and we do have a non-restrictive clause set off by commas, we can simply use que, or we can choose a form from the el cual grouping, but not el que. So for example, la reunión que comienza en 5 minutos va a ser muy aburrida. Anoche vimos una película la cual era muy divertida. So in both of these cases, we have non-restrictive clauses set off by commas. We're talking about a thing. We can use que or el cual. So I'd point out also that in the second case, I could also use que, right? Anoche vimos una película que era muy divertida. So the choice to use la cual here just affects the degree of formality, perhaps. All right, now let's take a look at some guidelines and patterns of usage that apply to relative pronouns when we're referring to people or persons. So first of all, as you can see on this slide, if we're speaking of a person or persons, we're using a relative clause, so there's no commas, and the relative pronoun is not preceded by a preposition. In all of these cases, we should simply use que. So you can use que, as we saw earlier, to talk about people. Examples. Ahí va la chica que vive en el 6º piso. O necesito escribirle al profesor que me asignó la tarea. ¿Hablaste con el hombre que conocimos anoche? So again, we're talking about people, but because there's no prepositions, no restrictive clauses set off by commas, we should just use que. So let's look at the second configuration for persons. If we're speaking of a person or persons using a relative clause whose relative pronoun is preceded by a preposition, but we're not using a non-restrictive clause set off by commas, quien or quienes, or a form from the el que or el cual groupings usually sounds best. Examples. Ahí va la chica de quien hablábamos ayer. There goes the girl of whom we were speaking yesterday. Ahí va la chica con la que hablaremos mañana, with whom we will speak tomorrow. Ahí va la chica acerca de la cual hablamos ayer, about whom we were speaking yesterday, or we spoke yesterday. Ellos son los colegas con quienes trabajé, con quienes. Ellos son los colegas con los que vas a trabajar, or ellos son los colegas al lado de los cuales trabajé. Now look at the last example. Ahí va la chica de que hablaste el jueves, of whom you spoke on Thursday, o ahí va la chica con que hablaste el jueves. As this example or these examples indicate, it is possible to use que with this configuration, but you'll usually only see this with the prepositions de or con. And despite being grammatically acceptable, I think they sound a bit odd. That's why I said quien or quienes, or a form from the el que or el cual groupings, usually sounds best. And again, notice that we're talking about constructions that require prepositions but aren't using clauses set off by commas. And also that after compound prepositions, like in this case, where was it? I think it was al lado de and acerca de, the long forms work best. Ahí va la chica acerca de la cual hablamos ayer, and ellos son los colegas al lado de los cuales trabajamos. And now finally we'll look at the third and final slide referring to persons, the third configuration. So for speaking of a person or persons, and we are using finally non-restrictive clauses set off by commas, we can use que, quien or quienes, or a form from the el cual grouping. Look at the examples. Mi mamá, que siempre dice la verdad, prometió llevarme a España. Or mi hermana, quien vivía en Portland, se mudó a Seattle. Mi tío, el cual se divorció en mayo, se casó de nuevo. So again, we have non-restrictive clause. In these cases, we're not seeing a preposition, and we're talking about people. We can use que, quienes, or el cual. I would point out, though, that as in the first example, in these types of constructions, the relative pronoun que is actually the preferred and the most frequently or commonly used form. So I could substitute que in all of these. Mi hermana, que vivía en Portland, or mi tío, que se divorció en mayo, so use que. Now I know I've given you a lot to digest in one sitting. I hope you've been taking notes. You can always rewind. But if you've been paying attention, you've probably realized that in most cases, despite everything I've presented, in most cases, que or quien, quienes will work. And this is very true and very useful to remember. In other words, there really is no grammatical imperative that forces us to ever use a form from the el que or el cual groupings. That's usually just a stylistic preference for more formal sounding speech or writing. Again, as this sort of graphic indicates, in almost all cases, it's grammatically sufficient to choose between just que or quien, quienes. In fact, we can take this reductionist approach one step further and say that que works just fine in most cases, in almost all cases. In fact, you can always use que unless the antecedent is a thing and a preposition other than con, de, or en precedes the relative pronoun. In these cases, use a form from the el que or el cual grouping instead. Or if the antecedent is a person and any preposition precedes the relative pronoun, then use quien or quienes. So of course, this streamlined approach works fantastically well as long as we always know whether or not we need a preposition. But that's a topic for an entirely different video lesson. All right, that concludes my presentation on relative pronouns and relative clauses in Spanish. I hope you found it to be informative and useful. As always, I welcome your questions, comments, or suggestions, and I'd love to hear what you thought about this particular video lesson. Be sure to visit my website, professorjason.com. You can also follow me on Twitter. I'm easy to find. And like my Facebook page, please. And you'll see information about those resources in just a second on the screen here. So thanks again for watching. This has been Professor Jason, your guide to Spanish. I hope to see you at the next lesson. Hasta pronto. Ciao.